this happened in order for manifestation to happen. The contraction happened so manifestation could happen.
Yes.
Why are we all trying to get back if we're here to manifest? It seems, and then we spend all our time trying to get back to unlimited or unveiled consciousness.
Because the veiling of itself is the price consciousness pays for manifestation. Consciousness has to consent to veil itself with its own activity in order to manifest its infinite potential. But in veiling itself from itself, it veils its innate sense of fulfillment. And therefore this veiling, the separate self, feels a sense of lack, feels an absence, feels disturbed, feels separate and therefore unloved or unloving. So it is innate in the separate self. The separate self, I'm sure you've heard me say it before, the separate self is like a rubber ball that has been squashed. The rubber ball is not in a state of equilibrium. There's no such thing as a compressed rubber ball that is in a state of equilibrium. The rubber ball is by definition tending to return to its natural condition. The separate self is like a contracted ball of consciousness with limited love, limited freedom, limited fulfillment, limited peace. And therefore the separate self, everything the separate self does, it is its nature it cannot help but want to go back to its natural condition. It is just the natural condition of the separate self.
Okay, so that's a condition of the separate self, not of the finite mind.
Well, in this, yes, in the separate self. Very often I use them synonymously.
But they're not. The finite mind is fine. That's just how we manifest, and we did this to manifest.
That's true. The separate self is a finite. We could say this. The separate self is a finite mind that believes it is a finite mind.
Right.
But in the absence of that belief, there is still the finite mind, finite experience, but it is no longer attributed to a separate self. We realize that the reality of what we are is infinite consciousness. In other words, let's take Ramana Maharshi as a symbol of a person in whom there was no belief or feeling of being a separate self. Nevertheless, he still saw his experience from the perspective of his body. When he was in his bedroom in Sri Ramanashram, he was not seeing the streets of London. His vision, his experience was limited. So he was experiencing finite experience from his located perspective. That's what I call the finite mind. But in him, the mind inside the finite mind was unlimited, like the space in this room. There was no personal sense of self there. But nevertheless, he still had finite experience.
So he was a finite mind with no separate self.
A finite mind, yes, in which knew its reality.
True self.
Which didn't believe, I am a finite mind or a separate self. He realized that the activity of thinking and perceiving, which was his experience, was simply the activity of infinite consciousness. He didn't take this activity as an entity. The finite mind as an activity is not a problem. Ramana Maharshi, the Buddha, they all experienced thinking, sensing, perceiving. As an activity, the finite mind is not a problem. It's when the finite mind seems to become an entity, a self unto itself. That is the separate self. The finite mind's belief that it is a separate self.
So the impulse, the rubber ball impulse to return, that's the separate self driving that. Ramana Maharshi didn't have that impulse. He was
exactly, yes, because he knew that what he called his self, his experience of himself, was awareness's experience of itself. So there was no sense of limitation in him. In other words, the self in him was the self of awareness. And with that came its innate peace and fulfillment.